Hi-ho, it's off to the backcountry discovery route of Idaho we go. Hey, it's Chris from A Territory Ahead of the Rest, and today we're doing a wet climb to Burnt Knob. Burnt Knob is a 95-year-old fire lookout station perched at 8,196 feet in elevation in central Idaho's Nez Perce National Forest, just above MacArthur, Stillman, and Burnt Knob lakes. And this adventure starts in the mountain hamlet of Elk City, Idaho at the Elk Creek Station Cafe, the last gas fill up for more than 100 miles on this section of the Idaho BDR. And of course, along for this trip are my backcountry brothers, Bruce, Rod, Jorge, and Dan. We've been friends for over 45 years since we met in the Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity at the University of Idaho. This is Jorge's maiden BDR voyage, but Bruce, Rod, Dan, and I have been traveling the Idaho backcountry discovery route since the summer of 2022, when we started in Jarbidge, Nevada, the southernmost point of the Idaho BDR. We've done a few sections each summer, working our way northward toward Canada, crossing Idaho bottom to top, avoiding pavement as much as we can. But none of the BDR sections we've traveled so far are anything like the Magruder Corridor, 110 miles of primitive road with no services and few signs of civilization along the way. It's named after Lloyd Magruder, a merchant from Rod Mine's hometown of Lewiston, who was robbed and axe murdered on the route while returning from the Montana gold mine towns in 1863. Magruder's close friend, Lewiston innkeeper Hill Beachy, investigated the crime scene and eventually tracked Magruder's killers to California, where he convinced the governor to extradite the suspects back to Idaho Territory to face trial. The case was the first capital murder trial ever held in district court and resulted in the first hanging in the Idaho Territory, the first legal hanging, that is. The Magruder Corridor is a single-lane dirt road built in the late 1920s that runs from the Red River Ranger Station near Elk City over Nez Perce Pass to Connor, Montana. It roughly follows the prehistoric trail created by the Nez Perce Indians, who've lived in this region for more than 11,000 years. As you climb toward Nez Perce Pass and the border of Idaho and Montana, on your right, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, and on your left, the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, a combined total of 3.6 million acres and just this one road between them. This is truly the back of beyond country of Idaho. In her excellent book, Backcountry Roads, Idaho, Lynna Howard writes how the Red River Ranger District area was the last place in the lower 48 to be mapped by the U.S. Geological Survey. The first accurate topographical maps of this area weren't available until 1979. What's also unique about the Magruder Corridor is that, unlike so many other western backcountry roads, there's no private land in holdings checkerboarding the region. Frank Shoemaker, who was a ranger here at the Magruder Ranger Station from 1947 to 1957, wrote a short history of the corridor, and he noted, "At no time has any of the corridor land been in private ownership. There is no record of any attempt to homestead any part of the corridor or to carry any of the mining claims to patent. The only improvements other than Forest Service stations, lookouts, and guard cabins have been a small number of trapper and mining cabins." While fur trappers surely explored the region after Lewis and Clark's 1805 passage to the east and north via the Lolo Trail, few, if any, decided to homestead here. The first documented Anglo on what is now the Magruder Corridor was in 1835. That's when a Presbyterian missionary from Ithaca, New York, the Reverend Samuel Parker, traveled with a band of Nez Perce Indians east from Salmon Mountain to Burnt Knob on his way to Walla Walla. Parker was very ill on that trip, and he survived despite administering his own bloodletting. That was the widely accepted frontier medical belief that removing blood from the body could cure a variety of ailments. So as you can tell, a lot of blood has been spilled around these parts, and we were not planning to contribute. But the colorful history of this place is just one of the reasons why, ever since we started our pavement as lava trek along the Idaho Backcountry Discovery Route, we've been looking forward to Burnt Knob. Now, after 3 summers of heading this direction, we'd finally arrived. We camped the first day at Poet Creek, a beautiful spot about a third of the way through the Magruder. And of course, it rained all night long. So July 30th dawned cold, wet, and misty, more like November 30th. This was the one day in our schedule we'd set aside to do Burnt Knob, and the lack of sunshine and visibility was disappointing. But this is what we've come to do, so we decided to try the trip anyway. Four low and be there, as they say. The sign at the start of the 1.5-mile road up to Burnt Knob says, maintained for 4x4 vehicles. But that basically means the deadfall trees are cut to allow 80-inch wide vehicles to pass. It doesn't mean the road surface is maintained, so we would be rock crawling the entire way. So up we went. Bruce and I took the lead at Rod's request, so he, along with Dan and Jorge aboard, could watch and learn from my mistakes. Credit to Roddy, his new TRD Pro 4Runner has less than 2,000 miles on it, and here he is, breaking it in on the Burnt Knob. Let's say that figuratively, hopefully not literally.
Sir, you had a look of sheer panic on your face.
Right?
Rod's TRD Pro and mine have the same Westcott suspension lift of about 1.5 inches. My 2021 has slightly bigger tires and an aftermarket front-facing under-the-bumper camera, which is why you see me looking at my center dash video screen as often as I'm looking out the windshield during this climb. Rod's newer 2024 4Runner has the factory video cameras front and back, plus side view cameras under both the rear view mirrors that make it a little easier to pick a path ahead. But technology or not, it was a slow slog up through the clouds. I wouldn't call it technical, just tedious. The road was just as rough at the bottom as the top, and when we finally made the summit and the lookout, it was just as foggy and wet at the top as it was at the bottom. There would be no sweeping scenic panoramas today, unfortunately.
Tell you, they make you pay to get to the top here.
Still, the mist shrouding Burnt Knob gave it an otherworldly feel. And with the weather and the road conditions, we didn't have to worry much about meeting another vehicle coming in the opposite direction. Probably not the brightest move to attempt a rough road none of us had traveled before in low visibility and rain, but after about 40 minutes, we made the summit. And we all took advantage of a surprisingly strong cell phone signal to alert loved ones that we were the conquering heroes. Burnt Knob was one of the earliest locations for the Idaho and Montana fire lookout building boom that was sparked, pardon the pun, by the Big Burn of 1910. While several sources claim Burnt Knob was first used as a lookout site in 1922, the Idaho County Free Press newspaper in nearby Grangeville published a story in July 1915 saying that Elmer Purdyman was manning the Burnt Knob lookout that summer. He was likely staying in this cabin nearby. The lookout structure that stands here today was built in 1930, the same year that the Magruder Corridor Road was finished, and Burnt Knob was staffed every season until 1960. It's no longer used and is one of just a handful of rare so-called Lookout Design Number 5 or L5 lookout cabins left. The other 3 surviving L5s in Idaho are at Bear Creek Point, Burton Peak, and Square Mountain. Measuring 10 by 10 or like Burnt Knob 14 by 14 feet with a gabled-shaped shingle roof, the Nez Perce L5 lookout design was unique to Region 1 of the Forest Service, which covers the Northern Rockies. According to the Forest Fire Lookout Association, during the heyday of fire lookouts in the 40s and 50s, Idaho had more fire lookouts of various designs than any other state in the country, 996. But beginning in the 1960s, thermal infrared technology, automatic lightning detection, and aircraft observation rendered many of those lookouts obsolete. Today, 150 lookouts are still standing across the state. And Burnt Knob is one of the most awe-inspiring, even on a day like today, with a view shrouded by low-lying clouds. Our time at Burnt Knob was cut short as the rain turned to sleet, looking almost like snow in the glare of our headlights and fog lights. We gingerly picked our way back down the road, and I made full use of Toyota's automatic crawl control to handle the gas and the brakes so I could focus on steering over and around the rocks. At the bottom of the hill, we celebrated our survival and posed for some photos before heading back to camp. Each rock that we had trundled over, each foggy glimpse of wilderness unseen, all were a verse in the story we'd tell those not foolish or lucky enough to come along. And you know, it's a tale that'll grow steeper and slicker every time it's told. Because after it was done, we realized that the treacherous trip to Burnt Knob was less about the view and more about the journey. While nature may sometimes hold her beauty hostage behind a curtain of mist, she is ever eager to grant her visitors a treasure far rarer, a lasting memory for lifelong friends. Burnt Knob, conquered. The Magruder Corridor, covered. Common sense? Well, left at the Elk City gas stop parking lot. But we wouldn't have it any other way.